Hello, this is Jonathan with Steelbear Academy. Today I'm going to be answering a question about what action type of handgun should I use? So we're talking about handguns here today. We're not talking about rifles or shotguns, though that's a topic for another day, but there's a question that I feel like doesn't get answered very often when people are picking their very first guns. Seems like there's so many different types, but I think really they all pretty much boil down to about 6 or 7 types. So I want to show you the types. I want to explain the differences between them, the pros and cons of them, why you'd want one over the other, and hopefully give some good information for both the new person and also somebody who's more experienced, for them to better understand why they're choosing their particular gun versus the one they've perhaps chosen by default. So the first thing I want to talk about is when we're talking about defensive handguns, and particularly when it comes to this action types, I'm going to be mostly focusing on the shootability, and perhaps even more specifically, how easy it is for us to shoot the gun accurately. So I'm going to refer to that as shootability for this video. I know shootability sometimes is the pleasantness of the gun. Today I'm going to be using it for shorthand. Shootability is the ability for us to shoot the gun accurately. And really that comes down to, in my opinion, a few things. But the main two things we're going to talk about are trigger weight and trigger travel distance. So trigger weight and trigger travel distance. And first I want to start off by showing some of the different action types so that the new people can get up to speed and be able to participate in this discussion. So I've got several guns here. They are all unloaded. First thing I want to cover is revolvers. So there's kind of two main types of revolvers. There's a single action revolver, and a single action revolver is one in which every time you pull the trigger, the hammer has to be cocked first. So when I cock the hammer like that manually, I pull the trigger, bang, it fires. I then have to cock it again, bang, cock it again, bang. And so you have to do that every single time. The reason why I call it single action is because the trigger only performs one action. All it does is drop the hammer. Single action. And usually they are pretty light, meaning the weight of them is pretty light, and the travel is very short. Do you see how short the travel is? It barely moves at all to fire those. And perhaps I should go over a definition of what I mean by trigger weight and travel. So the weight of a trigger is usually measured in pounds, in America at least. So if I say my trigger is a 10-pound trigger, what that means is it requires, you can imagine that if I had my gun like this and I attached weight to this trigger, I can put 10 pounds of weight on this trigger before it will move and fire. If this was a 1-pound trigger, I'd be able to put 1 pound of weight on here before it fires. So to visualize that, you can see that I can put the entire weight of this gun on the trigger and it's not going to fire in double action mode. We'll talk about what that means in a sec. In single action mode, I think this has like a maybe 4 or so pound trigger. I can still keep all the weight on there, but if I apply a little bit of pressure, it breaks. So I can't pull the trigger by pushing down on it very easily on this gun, but that is the pull weight. If you have a 5-pound trigger, that means that you have to put 5 pounds of weights on this trigger to make it fire. If you have a 10-pound trigger, you got to put 10 pounds of weight on this trigger. And this gun is probably like 4 or 5 pounds, maybe. Not sure exactly, but in the ballpark, maybe 4 pounds. And so I need to put, if this is a 5-pound trigger, it can hold the entire weight of the gun on the trigger, and it just needs a little extra weight. I'm pushing down slightly, bang, it fires. So that's what we're referring to trigger weight. The travel is the amount of distance it needs to travel before the hammer falls. So on this gun, if I pull it, that's how much distance the trigger needs to move in order for it to fire. What I was doing right there is called double action mode. So single action is where you cock the hammer, the trigger performs one action, it drops the hammer. On double action mode, your trigger performs two actions. It pulls the hammer back and it lets the hammer fall. Double action. So on a single action gun, you have a very light, very short travel trigger, which means it's usually pretty accurate, meaning the shootability is very high. Mechanical accuracy of the gun is not any different. Like if you put the gun in a bench rest, it'll still shoot the same. It doesn't, the trigger mechanism does not change the inherent accuracy of the gun. The inherent accuracy is based on the mechanics of the lockup and the barrel and the rifling and the crown and those things. The trigger really is just how we interface with the gun. So if the trigger sucks, it's harder for a human to pull the trigger and shoot the gun well. But the inherent accuracy of the gun is not really changed, if that makes sense. So the first thing, a single action revolver, we kind of covered it. Single action, you have to pull the hammer back every time, bang. A double action revolver, all you have to do is pull the trigger. You don't have to cock it back each time. You can just pull the trigger a bunch of times. Every time you pull the trigger, it rotates the cylinder and fires the gun. Like so. This type of gun is what we call a double action, single action revolver, meaning you have both options. So you've got the option of shooting double action, which I was doing just then, but I also have the option of cocking the hammer for a nice, easy to shoot single action shot. Very easy to shoot that in single action. But I have to do it manually. So the normal way I would shoot this gun is bang, bang, bang. If I want to take my time and go for a single action shot, I have to manually cock it. And then it's a nice, short, crisp trigger. So that's the double action, single action revolver. There's also a double action only revolver. There are many types of revolvers, but that configuration. Double action only means you don't have the option of cocking the hammer. The hammer is covered or internal, so you can't interact with the hammer in any way. So what that means is you have to pull the trigger like this. You don't have the option of cocking the hammer back with your thumb. And that's pretty much all the types of revolvers. The next type of gun I want to show you is the single action autoloader. So this is a revolver. Now we're moving on to autoloaders, also known as semi-automatic guns. So this is a 1911. This is by Springfield. A 1911 is a single action only pistol. So what that means is you have a hammer and the trigger is a single action only trigger. It performs one action. All it does is drop the hammer. The gun would then fire, bang, the slide cycles. The hammer is cocked again. You pull the trigger again, bang, bang. You see, I can only pull it once. So if for some reason that round didn't go off, I can't just pull it again. I have to either cock the hammer back manually, bang, fire. Then it cycles, or if I don't want to do that, I can just dump that round out of there, move on to another round, fire the next round, bang. So on this type of gun, there are many types of single action guns. However, usually nowadays, when we're talking about a single action gun, a 1911, which is this look and style and design of gun, is usually the main type of gun we're referring to. Like I said, there's Browning high powers and FN 5.7's a single action gun, and the Ruger 5.7, and there are many single action only guns, but by and large, when you're talking about a single action gun, we're talking about a 1911. Now, if you notice, this gun has a grip safety, so I have to push this down to fire the gun. If you take a look at the travel of this trigger, it's very short. This is the take up, and then I hit some resistance, bang, it fires. So it has a really short travel of trigger, and it's also fairly light. I think this is like a probably 5 to 6 pound trigger. I'm not sure exactly, but they can be lighter and they can be heavier. but I think that's a pretty good normal weight. So it has almost no take up, meaning you don't have travel. There's almost no travel. I take up the slack, and then I'm hitting resistance, and then bang, it fires. So this one has a pretty short travel of trigger. It's similar to the single action revolver in that regard. However, this is an auto loader, so you get to shoot it in succession without having to do anything, basically. You just keep pulling the trigger and it will keep firing. That's a single action auto loader. They also make something called a double action, single action auto loader. So, and I also, there's a gun that I don't have here that I'll have to illustrate that with this gun, but a double action only gun, a double action only auto loader, is one in which there's a hammer, meaning it's a hammer fired gun like this. You pull the trigger, and it's a pretty long, heavy trigger pull, bang. It fires, it recycles, and you can fire again. So it's kind of like a revolver in that regard, if this was double action only. However, this gun is not double action only. This is a double action, single action auto loader, or DASA for short. So what that means is, the way I would load this gun is I would take my mag, shove it on the bottom of the gun, chamber around. If you take a look, my hammer is now cocked. That means it is in single action mode, similar to this gun. However, I also have the option of lowering it to double action mode. So I have this thing here called a decocker. If I swipe down on it, it will safely lower the hammer and put it into double action mode. Now, this gun is in double action for the first shot. I fire the round, bang, it fires. Then the slide cycles, and now it's in single action. And if you see, my trigger is much further back, and this is a single action gun now. So when the hammer's down, the trigger is all the way forward. It's pretty heavy. It's a pretty heavy and long travel trigger pull. When it's in single action, it's a pretty short travel, and it's a pretty lighter weight trigger. So the way this gun works is, if you were going to carry it, you would chamber around, decock it, then you'd put it in your holster, and then when you bring the gun out, you pull the trigger, it fires, bang. The slide cycles, and then from shots 2 through however many you have are going to be single action. So the single action has a shorter travel and lower trigger weight. Does that make sense? Also, one other thing I forgot to mention about this gun, because it has a pretty light, it's a very light, short travel of trigger, it necessitates having a manual safety. So that's what this thing is. This is a manual safety. So when I push it up, it means the gun can't fire. When I swipe it down, it means the gun can fire. So the way you would carry this gun is you would carry it, oh, by the way, when we're talking about these guns, I'm going to assume that we're going to have we're going to have a round in the chamber of all these guns. So we're not going to carry them without a round in the chamber. So you can, that's a personal decision for you to make, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to assume that that's how you're going to be carrying this gun, all these guns. So you would carry it with a round in the chamber and the safety on. So this is what's called cocked and locked. The hammer is cocked, the safety is on, that's the locked part. So it's ready to fire, except that you need to turn the safety off. So I'm using my right thumb to actuate that. This gun also works left-handed, so you can activate it with the left hand. So we'll finish talking about the different action types, but this gun requires having a manual safety. It's pretty much it's a necessity because of the short travel and the low trigger weight. This gun does not have a manual safety, so there's nothing you have to turn on or off to be able to fire the gun. Whereas this gun, you have to turn something on or off to fire the gun. This gun's version of a safety is having a double action trigger pull. It's very heavy and it's very long of travel, so you are not going to accidentally fire this gun. You have to be deliberate. You deliberately have to pull the trigger. It's not going to just fire. It's got pretty heavy trigger weight. You can put the whole weight of this gun on here, and you can put a lot of weight down into it. It's not going to fire by accident. So that's a DASA gun. By the way, this is a SIG P220, in case you were wondering. Then we're moving on to the striker-fired guns. So this is a Glock 17. A striker-fired gun does not have a hammer. It's not a hammer-fired gun. Instead, what it has is something called a striker. And I don't know if it's really necessary for you to understand that part of it, but just for completion's sake, and I kind of find it fun and interesting. On a hammer-fired gun, the firing pin, that's the little thing that pokes the back of your round to ignite it. When you pull the trigger, that's you're activating the firing pin by slamming the hammer into the back of the firing pin, and then it hits forward and pokes the round in the chamber. That fires the gun. And that's the same on any hammer-fired gun. They just go about doing it in different ways. So that hammer hits the firing pin, that ignites the round. On a hammer-fired gun, what the trigger is basically doing is there's the hammer, that's this piece here. It is interacting with kind of the bottom or the back side of a mechanism attached to the trigger. So the trigger's over here somewhere, and there's this kind of little spot here that's attached to the hammer that's holding the hammer from throwing itself forward. There's a lot of energy, potential energy stored in there by a spring. And so when you push the trigger is basically moving this piece out of the way so that it can slip out of the way and the hammer can fall. That piece right here is called the sear. So the firing pin is resting. It's sitting, it's not doing anything. There's a spring that holds it in the resting position. When the hammer hits the back of the firing pin, it hits it, it protrudes, it hits the round, and then the spring pulls the firing pin back in and puts it back at rest. So the firing pin is floating in there, it's resting. That's how a hammer-fired gun works. A striker-fired gun does it in a different way. Instead of there being a hammer that smacks the back of the firing pin, instead there's a spring that is wrapped around the firing pin. So if this is the firing pin, there's a spring coiled around it. It's called a striker. And it's still got a firing pin, it's just called something else. And this spring is then compressed and kind of held in place as it's preparing to fire. So when you rack the slide on one of these guns, it is compressing that spring, preparing it for firing. And then what the trigger does, the trigger basically, there's a little hook back here that's hooked onto the striker, and it pushes a little further back and then lets it slip out, and then the firing pin moves forward, therefore igniting the round. So it just does it in a different way. It's not hammer fired, so it's not really a single action or a double action gun. It's its own thing. But in practice, it kind of functions like a single action trigger. At least the Glock does. Meaning, when you pull the trigger performs one action, it fires the round, bang, it cycles, it resets, and you can fire again. In that sense, it's kind of like a single action gun. However, and in addition, once you pull the trigger, you can't pull it again unless the slide cycles. So the slide, the round fires, bang, it cycles, bang. If for some reason on one of those clicks it didn't fire, you can't just pull the trigger again. You have to manually cycle the slide to fire again. It is also similar to a double action like this, in that the trigger weight and travel are not as heavy as the double action, a double action gun, but they are not as light as a single action gun. So it's kind of in the middle in terms of the weight and the travel. So if I pull the trigger, you got some take up, and then it's kind of heavy, and then you have to pull through. It's not as heavy as this gun or this gun for the double action, but it's not as light as the single action on any of these guns, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like if this is our version, if the double action is our version of a safety, this gun chooses to not have a safety really, a manually operated safety. So you kind of have like a halfway between a double action and a single action in terms of the travel and the distance and the weight. It's not as heavy as a double action trigger pull, and it's not as long as a double action trigger pull, but it's not as light as a single action. So it's like a hybrid. It's like in the middle, and it kind of raises a good question about what is heavy enough of a trigger pull and what is long enough of a travel to be considered safe enough to carry it. And that's a question we'll kind of answer at the end, but that's kind of the crux of the issue about the trigger weight and the trigger travel. So in terms of ease of shooting the gun, this gun is the easiest. Well, this gun is easiest to shoot if you were shooting it like normal. However, this gun in single action is actually the easiest to shoot. So this one has a very light, very crisp trigger pull. This gun is next easiest to hit with because it's got a very light, short trigger pull. Then this gun in single action is next easiest to hit with. And then this gun is next easiest after that. And then we start the double actions. So this gun is kind of right in the middle of ease. It's harder to hit with than the single action on this gun by quite a bit. Then this gun, it's like a light double action. And then we start moving into the double actions in terms of difficulty. Then I'd say this gun is easier to hit with in double action. Just that first shot, right? And then the double action revolver. This one's very smooth, so it's actually kind of a toss-up. But my point is, when we're looking at the shootability of these guns, the weight and the travel are the thing that really separates these guns in terms of their ease of shooting. So those are kind of the action types. And next I want to do a couple of disclaimers. So I'm showing you some specific guns. They are representative of their type. So this is a Glock 17. It's a striker-fired gun. It is representative of all striker-fired guns. Same thing with this SIG. It's representative of DASA guns. Same thing with these, same thing with these. I'm going to be painting with kind of a broad stroke in terms of the action types, but some guns have different features. For example, this SIG is a decocker only type DASA gun. So it has a decocker here so that when I cock the hammer, I can swipe down on this, it decocks it. Some DASA guns don't have a decocker per se. They instead have a manual safety, like a single action only SIG, for example. They make that. It's more similar to this type of gun. However, that would be a single action gun. It wouldn't be the category of double action, single action. So there's also CZ models, for example, that are double action, single action. So they have a double action mode, but they don't have a decocker, but they do have a safety. And you can carry them cocked and locked, like this gun, where you would, chamber around and then turn a safety on and then carry it like that. Or you can put that safety down and then manually lower the hammer with your thumb to put it into double action mode. So even though there is a safety on the gun, it doesn't function in that mode. And then there are also some DASA guns that do have a safety that you can turn on in double action mode, like a Beretta 92, for example. I would suggest getting a decocker only pistol if you were going to get one of these, just so you know. That way you don't ever have to worry about manually decocking with your hand. if that makes sense, or holding onto the hammer. A manual, a decocker is recommended for those. So again, I just want to say I'm using these as examples, but they're not every possible gun ever. So just so you know that. So why, now that we've kind of talked about these, and I've sort of explained that this one in single action is easiest, then this, then this, then this, and so on. Why is it easiest? Well, it really has to do with how we interact with the trigger. So I'll use this gun as an example. When you're shooting a gun, the thing that determines if you hit your target or not is where the barrel is, where the muzzle is pointing, and really how perfect you can keep that muzzle from moving around. So if I cock the hammer and I'm aiming at something, I'm going to even be resting on the table here. If I don't move the barrel and it fires, it's going to hit right where I had my sights lined up. However, that's pretty hard to do in practice. So if I'm out, I'm a better shot than this, but I'll explain it so you can see it in more action. So if I was going to shoot this gun and I'm going to demonstrate a sloppy trigger pull, if I pull the trigger and I pull the gun like that, do you see how much my muzzle is moving off target? That's really the reason people miss usually. So hitting with your gun is as easy as keeping the muzzle where you want it and making it so that the trigger is pulled without moving the gun, right? That's about all accuracy really is. But it's harder than that, that's the general easy way to do it, but it's not easy in practice. And so these different trigger systems interact with us in a way that makes it easier to do that or harder to do that. And easier in certain circumstances and harder in other circumstances. So for example, if you're shooting any of these guns at 7 yards, 7 yards is pretty close. It's like from where I'm standing to, just the wall there. It's not very far. So any of these guns are going to hit acceptable accuracy so long as you're doing a pretty good trigger pull. So long as you're doing a pretty good job, you're going to be able to hit a human-sized target pretty easily. The differences are going to manifest more at distances. So once you get past 25 yards, for example, 25 yards for a handgun is kind of far. You wouldn't normally be shooting a handgun in a defensive situation at 25 yards. That's quite far. But if you were going to shoot that far, that's when the different action types are going to really show their weaknesses, let's say. For example, if I had a double action only revolver and I was expected to shoot at 25 yards with a higher recoiling caliber, like let's say 357 Magnum or 44 Magnum or anything that's more higher recoiling than like 38, if it's double action only, it's going to be pretty hard marksmanship wise for me to keep this gun from moving at 25, 30, up to 50 yards or more. It's going to be quite hard for me to be able to hit what I consider acceptable accuracy, something like, this big at any distance. If I can hit this big at 7 yards, I'm happy. If I can hit this big at 30 yards, I'm very happy because I know this is really hard at 30 yards. But if I could hit this at 100 yards, then I'd say, dang, Jonathan, with a handgun, that's impressive to be able to hit this group at 100 yards. That's really, really hard. So it all depends on the context. But at close distances, all of these are going to perform almost the same. At farther distances, that's when the differences are going to come out. But the trigger pull and trigger weight are not only about the accuracy. There's reasons why we build guns these ways. So let me I'm going to go down the line and talk about the pros and cons of each action type. So now that we know what they are, let's talk about why you would choose one or the other. And I think I'd like to start with, I'll start with the single action autoloader. So I'm going to talk about the pros and cons. So remember, this is a 1911, but any single action gun is probably going to have these characteristics. So here's the pros. The pro is that this gun is very easy to shoot due to its trigger pull. So it has a trigger that goes straight back, which is kind of unique, honestly. So if I pull this trigger, it doesn't pivot or move like this, like all these other triggers do. Instead, it goes straight back, and it's a pretty light trigger pull weight, and it's a pretty short travel. So this gun is kind of the gold standard for autoloaders of the ease of shooting. That's why so many competitors use 1911s, for example. They're very consistent. They don't have, like, every single trigger pull is exactly the same. It's always that nice, crisp, short travel, low weight firing. Very consistent. Now that's kind of the pros, but let me change my script here. The con, as I sort of already mentioned, is that this has a manual safety. So in terms of like the accuracy, manual safety doesn't really affect the accuracy. This is a factor that is inherent to the gun's design that you have to work around if you're going to pick this gun as your defensive gun. So it has a manual safety. So that means this gun has to be put on fire in order to fire. It is easy to forget to turn it off. Now this is something that can be alleviated by training. If you practice turning that safety on and off and on and off over and over and over again, every time you pull the gun out to fire it, you can pretty consistently remember to do that. It kind of becomes part of your muscle memory of doing it. However, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen somebody with a single action gun, whether it's a 1911 or some other gun, they pull it out, they go to, they're shooting at the range, they pull it out, and what's wrong with this gun? It's not working. And then they, try to tap rack bang it or whatever. It doesn't work. Yo, my gun's not working. And people come over, they're like, really, what's wrong with that? I've never seen that gun malfunction there. And then I turned the safety on. I left the safety on. Click, bang. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen that. Whether it's at a competition or even just at the range. I've seen it on somebody qualifying for their CCW. It happens. If you think it can't happen to you, I think you are wildly misunderstanding the tendency of humans. You may think that you're tough shit, and maybe you are, but I'm just saying that the con to me is that it is not as simple as these other guns, and it is very likely that you, meaning Mr. or Mrs. Shooter, you might mistakenly forget to turn that safety off when you need it. And that to me is a very big downside. So I'm not going to belabor that point, but don't get too big for your britches. Don't think that you're some sort of tactical god. Don't think that you're not subject to human tendencies. Keep it simple. If you don't have a manual safety, you'll never forget to turn it on or off. Okay? The other thing that I want to point out is because it's got such a short travel and low trigger weight, it's very easy to have a negligent discharge with this type of gun if you're lackadaisical with the trigger, with your trigger finger. So good trigger discipline means that you've got the finger up high and away from the gun, resting on either the frame or the slide if you really want to be extra diligent, so that you don't accidentally let your finger go on the trigger. Now, on a single action gun, it is, because you have the manual safety, it is the gun starts to you subconsciously start associating a safe gun versus a not safe gun. And that's not really what you should be doing. That's not a good practice. Instead, you should always have good trigger discipline and always keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target and you've decided you're going to shoot right that instant. People get into trouble when they are they are, shooting at a target, and then they're kind of resting and bang, resting, bang. They take some breaths, and then they, hey, Johnny, whoa, bang, it fired, right? Somebody may have startled them, whatever. And so this type of having a manual safety breeds reliance on it, let's say, in my opinion. Now, that may not happen for everybody, and it might just be a new, inexperienced shooter type thing. However, I still think it is not a good idea to have one. In my opinion, you need to just get very, very comfortable with having this be your safety. This is the only safety that counts. You can't rely on the manual safety. You can't rely on any safeties except for the one in between your ears, right? Additionally, it's easy to forget to turn it off, but it's also easy to forget to turn it on. So this is something that I think a lot of people who go to the range who practice with single action guns don't take into consideration. You should be practicing turning that safety off every time you bring it up, putting it back on anytime you're pausing. Bang. Bang, bang. Every single time. And that should be something that is just like part of your normal routine, and practice it a lot. However, the tendency is that you might finish shooting your mag. You should finish shooting, bang, it locks back. It locks back. You drop your mag, get your new one, chamber around. Maybe you remember to turn the safety on before you come back, or it's easy to forget to remember to turn that safety back on as well as turn it back off. So I'm not going to tell you any more about that, but basically it's just added complexity. It's equally likely that it's going to, maybe not equally likely, it's likely that it's going to screw you over, is basically what I'm saying. Having a manual safety it's not a good thing on a defensive gun, in my opinion. You need to remember to turn it on after a defensive encounter, and if you're reholstering with your gun off safe, that is incredibly dangerous. It's very easy to accidentally pull that very light, very short travel trigger. So you need to have that safety on, preferably holding on the hammer as you are reholstering, if that makes sense. Let's talk about the double action next. So the pros of this is that because it has a very heavy, very long travel, you're very unlikely to have a negligent discharge. You have to want it to pull that trigger, right? You're not going to accidentally pull that trigger. And this is a pro in the sense that somebody who's new with not very well established trigger discipline. Now, I will say, if somebody's new and they're not establishing trigger discipline, that is something that they need to work on that ASAP before anything else. That and muzzle control, right? Not pointing the gun at something you're not willing to destroy. But this is the real world. Let's talk about the real world like it is. Many people who are new are going to make mistakes, and they're going to accidentally rest their finger on the trigger. I have seen a guy who, I've seen many people actually, who, they forget to do that. At the range, I'm sure you see it many times, that people rest their finger on the trigger when they shouldn't. It is just part of being around other people. You can't control everybody around you. So you can control where you go, but my point is that at some point, somebody may make a mistake, and this gun is far more forgiving. Any double action gun is far more forgiving of having poor trigger discipline. Additionally, the gun is always ready to fire. There's no manual safety to turn on or off, so more simple. And it's always consistent if you're only shooting in double action mode. So every double action trigger pull is just the same as every other trigger pull. And that's going to be the same on this gun, this gun, this gun. It's not on this gun. So this one is the anomaly. But this is consistent trigger pull, which is a good thing. The downside of this type of gun is it is the hardest of all these guns to shoot accurately. It is a heavy trigger pull, and it's got heavy travel. So with a heavy trigger pull, you have to exert more force. And when you exert more force, you're more likely to also move the gun off because you've got more force to contend with. You've got more force to control. You got to put 8 pounds or 10 pounds of pressure. That pressure can go wherever. It could move the whole gun. It could do lots of things, right? Additionally, when you have longer travel, there's more opportunities for you to mess it up along the way. And you have to articulate your finger. And when you articulate your finger, the tendency is for your hand to move along with you. And the tendency is for your hand to, let's say, rest in a more ergonomic position, which for a right-handed shooter tends to be skewed a little to the left. So the travel of your trigger is it is less important, or it affects accuracy less if the trigger pull is wet, if the weight is less, but heavy plus long travel is the recipe for it being hard to shoot. So double action guns, they're kind of the hardest of any of these guns to shoot. I see people who have never shot a double action revolver, and they, despite it being very simple to use, it is very easy to miss with these types of guns. So people often come from, shooting a Glock because that is kind of the go-to recommendation, and people buy them, and then they learn how to shoot it pretty well, and then they go learn how to shoot a double action revolver, and they are all over the place. It's easy to shoot it, but it's hard to hit with it, let's say. So this type of gun, if somebody's good with a double action revolver, they are probably going to be good with every other gun on here, because this is the most challenging type of gun, especially if you've got a short barrel, and if you've got a lightweight gun. Those guns are so difficult to shoot accurately. Again, I'm not saying you can't hit with them at 7 yards. I'm saying to be really good and really consistent and have a group, this size is really hard with a lightweight double action revolver. So I don't have a double action only revolver here to show you, but the pros of that is basically that you'll never have to deal with the single action capability. You don't have to worry about the consistency is as consistent as it gets, right? You don't have to worry about having a different other thing that you can mess up. So simplicity goes up. Additionally, with a double action only, you don't have to worry about your hammer getting caught on anything. This is not the same on every single DAO gun. So like if you had a double action, one of these, you might still have a hammer that you can interact with, or at least that's still there, moving. But on a revolver double action only, usually it's covered or concealed, shrouded at least, so you can't interact with it. Meaning it can't get caught on stuff. But I will say, to get to the double action, single action revolver, so I was kind of referring to this gun just as a double action gun, but a DASA revolver, the benefit of this type of setup is that you do have the option of doing that nice, crisp single action shot. So to me, the scenario that I see that this could be a benefit is, let's say you are not the person involved directly in the self-defense engagement. Like let's say, I think that the example that most comes to mind is two scenarios. One is like, let's say somebody's robbing a liquor store and you're in the liquor store but not at the counter, let's say. And the bad guy's got his own gun out. He's pointing at the clerk saying, give me the money. And he's saying that he's going to shoot him. He's saying that, give him the money or he's going to shoot him. Assuming everything else is equal, meaning we're not going to play the what if game about this, but if you're kind of far away and you're not directly involved in the incident, but self-defense, you can justifiably defend this other person with your gun, let's say. It is feasible that you might want to use single action to get a better shot. So if you know that if you know that you need to get a really good, perfect shot, that's when having this single action mode might be a benefit. Because you can hit much, much easier a precise shot, meaning like you're shooting for the head, let's say. You can get a much more precise shot with single action. Now, I'm just giving you that as an example. Perhaps you don't want to even get involved in that type of situation, but I was trying to say that that person was imminently going to kill that man. So there are many, many what ifs, but in that scenario, I was saying death for that clerk was imminent. That guy said he was going to shoot him in a second as soon as he gives him the money. Most reasonable people would think, okay, well, that guy is about to be killed. I could be using deadly force to protect that guy. Not saying you should get involved with such things, but just for the scenario. Another scenario that comes to mind is, let's say, the mass shooter scenario. Now, I know mass shooters are incredibly rare, and it's incredibly rare for any one person to be involved in that scenario. However, it's on the topic of all of our minds because it seems to happen so frequently and with such wide news publicity. But let's say, God forbid, you are in a mass shooting scenario where you have a gun and you have the ability to shoot at the target or the bad guy, the perpetrator of this tragedy. If let's say it's probably he, let's say if he is shooting indiscriminately at people, trying to kill everyone he can around him, and let's make it even more specific. Let's say you don't have the ability to run away. Let's say you've got your granny with you. Granny's with you and she can't run that fast. You need to probably fight. That's probably the best thing you could do at that moment. Well, if that bad guy is shooting at some people over there, but you're over here and he's kind of out of eyesight, you probably are legally justified to shoot at him, right? I'd say it's very unlikely, very hard to find a what-if scenario where that's not acceptable. But if he's shooting people indiscriminately, you're going to take your shot, let's say. If you're kind of far away, that's when single action might be the time to go for it. At least that first shot, right? You take your gun out, you cock your gun single action, bring your gun up. I'm not holding correctly just because I don't want you to be able to see me, but let's say we're taking our shot, we take our shot, bang. We try to hit that first shot in the head, right? That's the turn somebody off, stop the threat right there and then, right? That's a scenario where I could see single action being useful. And me personally, I like that option. However, I will say that it is also a potential that you can get this snagged on things. It's a potential that if you cock it into single action and then for some reason you don't need it, for some reason somebody tackles the guy right then and disarms him, something like that. Well, now you've got a cocked gun. Now you need to decock the gun, and then you have to grab the hammer, pull the trigger, lower it safely, and all that stuff can be really hard when you were just about to shoot somebody, right? That your adrenaline's going to be jacked up. I'm just saying that it's useful in some scenarios, but also has some downsides as well. I would also say that you basically are never going to use single action in most defensive situations involving yourself, meaning like they're aggressing on you, because the single action is a function of going for accuracy over speed. And the double action, you pull it out and you can pull the trigger, bang. You pull it out, you have to cock it. You're wasting time, and time is not your friend in a defensive situation. So I would say that the DASA revolver is very, very useful for people who are new, or any double action is very useful for people who are new, because you might not be that great at trigger discipline, and this might be a way to temper that, to keep you safer until you're able to establish that better. Now, how long does that take? That should be priority number one. Priority number one is get good trigger discipline. Priority number two is keep your gun in a safe direction. And those two are both priority number one. Be safe with your gun is the most important thing. Let's move on to double action, single action. So on a double action, single action, the pros are you've got the safety of having a heavy trigger pull. So that first trigger pull is very heavy, bang, it fires. Now you've got the lightness of having a better trigger for shots 2 through however many, 2 through 15, 2 through 17, whatever it is. So you're giving up consistency. Now you have the problem of your gun is very different from shot 1 to shot 2 through 20. You're giving up consistency for the benefit of the first shot being the nice heavy trigger pull, meaning safe, very safe. You're not going to accidentally pull that trigger. And you're giving up some of consistency for the benefit of having this type of trigger, or at least closer to this type of trigger, if it makes sense. At the cost of having to learn how to shoot this gun in 2 different modes. And as I said with this gun you're going to have to practice turning that safety on and off. This gun, you're going to have to be practicing decocking it, firing that first round, cycling it, shooting the first single action shot, maybe even the second or third single action shot, and then decocking it, coming back, resting, and then do that same drill again and again and again and again and again and again and again, because it is so common for people who have this type of gun to only practice the single action shots, because that's the majority of your shots. I had somebody who didn't even know that what this lever did. They just thought that this was just there for fun or something. They didn't understand the whole concept of lowering your hammer for safety, for the safety of the gun. That's your safety. So with this type of gun, you are giving up that consistency in order to have it be safer and also easier to shoot in those 2 scenarios. Now, the first shot is hard to shoot. The second through however many is easier to shoot than the first shot, but not quite as easy as this gun, definitely not as easy as single action on this gun. So it also requires more training in the sense that remember how you had to turn the safety on for this gun and turn it off? Well, in this gun, you have to remember that after you shoot, you need to remember to decock it. And that, it might not sound like a lot, but it's if you don't practice decocking it as just a normal course of action, then it can be easy to forget to do that. And you really don't want to be carrying this light and this short of travel of trigger in your holster, let's say. So this gun is more complicated than pretty much any of these other guns because it has it gives you so much control, which is both a good and a bad thing. But I dig them. I don't really need the added benefit of the heavy trigger pull weight for myself because I have given myself really good trigger discipline practice and trigger discipline diligence. However, I don't want to get too big for my britches. It is very possible that I might make a mistake. That's when the double action can really save your bacon. Additionally, if you reholster, you can keep your finger on the hammer to make it so you can't pull the trigger, meaning the gun can't fire. So this is a way people often holster their guns. They keep their finger on the hammer, slip it into their holster. Next, we're going to talk about the striker-fired guns. So as I mentioned, this gun has a medium weight and medium trigger pull distance. So it's easier to shoot than double action only, harder to shoot than single action only. And additionally, it always, I have a Glock in my hand, and the Glock kind of is the originator of this type of action. It's not the first, but it is the it is pretty much the gun that inspired all the other striker-fired guns of the modern production right now. So even though it's not the first, it is essentially the granddaddy of all striker-fired guns. It always irks me when people talk about a Glock being extra safe. It is extra safe in regards to it has a firing pin block, and it has I think a hammer block. It's got some cool internal safeties, the most important of which is your hammer block or your firing pin block safety, meaning the firing pin can't move forward unless you pull the trigger. It pushes a little pin out of the way so that the firing pin can move freely. So this gun can't fire unless you pull the trigger. Same thing with this gun, same thing with this gun, same thing with this gun. Although this particular 1911 does not have that firing pin safety. It uses a different mechanism, but it is drop safe though through a different mechanism. But my point is that people talk about this type of gun like it is somehow very safe. It's very safe in the regards to the drop safety, yes, but in terms of the likelihood of us making a mistake and having sloppy trigger discipline, this gun is probably the worst of all these guns. It's the least safe because there is nothing stopping you from pulling this relatively lightweight trigger. Additionally, it's pretty lightweight, at least as far as these guns go. It's pretty lightweight, so it's pretty easy to accidentally pull it. And its travel is not quite as long as these, I'd say. So it's not safer, except in the fact that it is more safe than things that don't have drop safeties. Other than that, it's basically just a single action only gun that has a heavy and long travel, in my opinion. And it really begs the question, how much weight and how much travel is enough to be a safe gun to carry? Well, for many, many people, this gun is not safe enough for them. They think that this gun it's too easy to accidentally pull the trigger. And I think they're not wrong. I mean, if you have sloppy trigger discipline, if you have a tendency of letting your finger slip onto that trigger and you don't have it really, keep it glued to the side, make sure you are very diligent about that, then this gun is basically a negligent discharge magnet. It attracts that type of action, right? People need to just be aware that we, the human, is the thing that causes the accident. However, some guns facilitate that more than others. So this type of gun facilitates it more than others if you don't remember to use the safety. And even if you do remember to use the safety, you still have to be really diligent with your trigger discipline. So when we're talking about relative safety, they're all relatively dangerous. They're all dangerous items, right? We shouldn't ever think of them as safe versus unsafe. They should all be thought of as dangerous. But this gun is more dangerous to a newbie than all these other guns. Actually, maybe not this gun. This gun, I think, is even more dangerous to a newbie. But this type of gun, at least if you have someone show you how to use it and show you, really drill into you good trigger discipline, this gun at least breeds you extra fear that you cannot rely on anything other than keeping your finger off the trigger. So it's kind of like a all or nothing type of thing. Like, there's nothing stopping you from pulling the trigger, which is a good thing if you actually want to pull the trigger, but there's nothing stopping you if you don't want to pull the trigger either. So there's no safety to accidentally put on, but there's also no safety to save you if you make a mistake. It's far less forgiving. I will also say that the trigger is not as good as this trigger, and not as good as this trigger, and not as good as this trigger. So it kind of is, it's the middle of the road, right? That's the nature of this gun. It's middle of the road at pretty much everything. if you're trying to shoot anything beyond 25 yards with the stock Glock trigger, it's going to be pretty hard. So you just need to understand that this type of gun, it sacrifices very good shootability for having middle of the road, good accuracy closer, better than these in terms of double action. It sacrifices that to have more easy shots closer than 25 yards, and it gives you the benefit of always having your gun ready to fire, which is a plus in my opinion. And it also has it so that it's always consistent, which is the downside of this type of gun, right? So the striker-fired gun is good for certain things, but you just need to be aware that when you're picking your gun, you are making choices about what things you value safety-wise and what things you value accuracy-wise. Now, for a newbie, I think it really doesn't matter. I think you can learn to shoot any of these guns very well. I also would like to point out that a striker-fired gun generally is going to have a lower bore axis than most of these other guns. So bore axis is where the barrel is. So that's where the barrel is. How high up it is relative to my hand. So as you can see, it's basically right above my hand compared to this gun, which its barrel is right here. It is significantly higher on this type of gun. So bore axis means that your gun is going to have less muzzle flip as it provides a different leverage point. The leverage point is higher, meaning you've got more energy pulling your muzzle off target, let's say. So that is a benefit of the striker-fired gun as well. That is not really related to trigger, but it could be part of the equation. Ooh. Something else that we've sort of covered is reholstering. So when it comes to reholstering, as I said, this type of gun you can rest your finger on the back of and keep it from firing. Same thing with this gun, same thing with this gun. This gun, you can't really do that. You have to really be mindful that you don't have anything stuck in your trigger guard of your holster that can pull this trigger. Oh yeah, one other thing. There's so many things to cover, but something else that always annoys me is when people talk about this little piece of plastic right here that is on your trigger shoe. They talk about this like it is a safety. I don't consider this a safety in the slightest. To me, this is a trigger, an anti-trigger pulling device that makes it so that the gun isn't fired due to getting dirty or because of inertia. So this little blade prevents the trigger from moving backwards unless that little blade is pulled first. So that little blade is resting against the back of the trigger guard there, right in there. It's just preventing the trigger from coming back. I need to push that little button so that the trigger can come back. Okay? That little blade does not stop you from firing the gun at all. If you put your finger on the trigger, you're going to be disengaging that little blade. You really shouldn't think of it as a safety. It is a inertia prevention, an inertia trigger pull prevention device. That's what I would call it. That doesn't roll off the tongue as well, but don't think of it as a safety. Don't be that guy who tells somebody, no, this gun's very safe because it's got this little thingy right here that if you put your finger on it, you got to put your finger on it to pull the trigger. Don't call that a safety. Don't trick somebody into thinking that is somehow safe. A safety, if you want to call it something that makes somebody safer, is having more trigger travel and trigger pull weight. That is actually what keeps somebody safe, or at least relatively more safe. So when it comes to reholstering, you need to be extra careful with anything getting into your trigger guard. Reholstering is the time when it is most likely that you'll have a negligent discharge, at least in my opinion. So take your time. Don't reholster in a hurry. Don't push that holster. Don't pull it like that. You need to take your time, clear your cover garment, look in there, finger off the trigger, go slow. Has anyone ever had to reholster in a hurry? Not really. It doesn't need to be done quickly. That is the most dangerous time. Take your time, go slow. Reholstering needs to be slow. So, yeah, man, we covered a lot of information, but I started this video off by asking some important questions about why would you choose different action types. Well, hopefully now you have a better understanding of why you would choose one or the other. It's really all about what do you value? What types of things are you most concerned about? Are you concerned about you making a mistake? You letting your finger slip on the trigger, accidentally pulling the trigger? Well, then a double action type of gun is probably better for you than a single action or a striker fire type of gun, because the trigger pull weight and the distance is going to prevent that from happening easily. It won't prevent it from happening, it just will prevent it from being easily happening. I also wanted to talk about, this was all oriented toward the beginner, but as you are getting more and more, picky about your guns, once you have a lot of experience, then you can start being more picky, let's say. And there's no reason why you should not be evaluating your own options, about evaluating your choices of gun. So for example, I'll just kind of give you my own little, my own thought process on when I'm picking a defensive gun. There are so many factors that go into picking your defensive, let's say, concealed carry gun. It's not just about the action type. It's also about the weight. It's about the reliability. It's about the availability of holsters, the availability of parts, the availability of sights, the cost of your ammunition, what caliber you're choosing, how well you can shoot it. The list goes on. But for me, what I am noticing most recently is that, this is my carry gun. This gun and this gun have been my carry guns. And I have found that I can shoot this gun very well. Within 20 yards, I can hit what I want to hit, pretty darn well. I'm very confident with this gun, and especially its reliability, but all these guns are very reliable. However, when I shoot this gun in single action mode, I am especially amazed how easy it is to hit at a distance. So when I take time to go do those longer shots, most of the time it's at 7 yards. Most of the time I'm practicing at 7 yards, but when I want to take the time to go shoot those farther distances, I think to myself, which of these guns am I going to want to take those shots with? Well, it's going to be with either this gun or this gun. Or this gun in single action mode, but I've kind of moved on beyond revolvers as a kind of primary concealed carry gun. Maybe they'd be a good backup, but not really a primary gun for me, at least. I like a semi-auto. So when I want to shoot those far distances, the single action on this gun and the single action on this gun are so much easier to hit at a distance with. And by that same token, at any distance, if I want to tighten that group up, if I want to take that headshot, even at 10 yards, at 15 yards, it's hard to hit a really precise headshot with this type of gun, meaning like, a head is this big, right? This is how big a head is. But if you're trying to hit the brain, let's say, the brain is a lot smaller. The brain is like this big. And if we're talking about that spot right behind the nose, the bridge or right behind the top of the nose, and that spot that can turn someone off, right? The spot that is essentially in that brain, frontal cortex, brainstem, heart of the brain type area. That's a pretty small target. That's like this big, right? Can I hit this good of a group consistently with this gun? At 7 yards, yes. At 15 yards? No. And going fast, can I hit it really fast? No. So but with this type of gun and this type of gun, I absolutely can, or at least at much greater consistency I can. And shot placement is really that's really the heart of using your handgun, at least in self-defense, in any gun, but especially the handgun. Shot placement really matters. It doesn't really, it's way better to hit the spot you actually want to hit rather than, some errant spots around the spot you want to hit. So for me, as I am becoming more and more stringent with the types of guns that I want, or at least to carry, the DASA gun is starting to appeal to me more and more again, because I'm giving up some of the consistency of the one type of trigger pull with this type of gun to gaining the better accuracy on that second through 10th shot with this gun. And I also find that I don't have any problem hitting double action even out to 25 yards. I can hit acceptably out to 25 yards with double action. So I've gotten good enough to the point where I can do that. So my point is that if you're somebody who's watching this and you're thinking to yourself, well, I know all these action types. I've already done my research. Well, I hope you have, and I hope that you take from this reevaluating what you value. It's not just about, can I shoot any of these guns? If you're pretty good with guns, you can shoot any of these guns pretty well. But as you get better and better, you might like to specialize in having a particular gun that does a particular thing really well. And for me, that particular thing well that I want is, I don't want to have a manual safety, and I want to be able to hit more accurately with my gun. And then I also want, all those other things, reliability and capable caliber and all those other things. But, a DASA gun is starting to appeal more and more. Now, that doesn't mean that it's perfect, and I haven't decided if this is going to be a new carry gun for me, but, it is a bit larger. It is definitely a bit larger. And just a little thinner. This holds way less rounds, so I hope that this has been helpful for you in not only evaluating your own, not only evaluating what gun to recommend for somebody who's new, whether that's you who's listening who's new, or you're recommending for somebody else, but understanding that it's not just say, when you look online, it's like, oh, just pick the Glock. Well, why do you pick the Glock? Hopefully you understand better the pros and cons, that this is a good middle road specialization. It's not as specialized as learning how to shoot this gun. It's not as specialized as learning this gun. And it's not as specialized as learning this gun. Instead, it's easier. It's kind of like a light double action gun. I think that also I want to point out that, the downsides of this type of gun are going to get less and less as companies improve their triggers. So for example, I've been kind of talking about the Glock trigger being not that easy to hit with. Well, that might just be the Glock trigger, It might be that the Glock trigger, due to its nature, due to its design, is it's kind of like a two-stage trigger where you have some take up, and then you've got this resistance, and then you kind of pull through this mushy business, and then it fires. That mushy business doesn't really lend itself to accurate fire. But let's say that mushiness was gone. Now we're kind of talking about like a two-stage trigger, more like this gun on the second stage. And so then it really changes the dynamic a little bit, because now we're talking about, if we're saying that this gun is as easy to hit with this gun, that really changes the equation quite a bit. So even though I'm referring to this gun as a representative, it is not every single striker fired gun. Like for example, the Walther PPQ and PDP, or the CZ P10 FRC, or even the SIG 320. Those guns all have better triggers than the stock Glock trigger. So, there's a whole lot that goes into it. And if you're things are swirling around in your mind, like so much information. Well, I just gave you a ton of information that probably you don't even really need to know. I think that all of this is kind of secondary to you picking the gun that feels good in your hand and that matches your budget and matches your caliber choice and is something you can afford to shoot and something you can afford the gun and fits on your body if you're going to carry it and all these things. So you can learn how to shoot any of these guns. Don't feel like, I've somehow told you shouldn't shoot a striker fired gun or told you that this type of gun is too hard for you to shoot or anything like that. You can learn to do all those things, I think. So if you need help, go seek out somebody who can help you. Go seek out somebody who's an instructor, who's in your area, that you mesh really well with and that is really good at helping you and understands how to help you. So seek out somebody who's qualified. If you have any questions, leave me a comment and I can give you some suggestions on things to look for. I hope this has been helpful for you. My name is Jonathan. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.